following that kind of thing in arguing that's one of the problems of knowledge, showing what's necessary for knowledge. One more, please. I think I have no more here. No, that's it?
No, that's it.
Okay, so he also talks about what is the central problem of epistemology. Here's the central problem of epistemology. Is knowledge reducible to a pure registering by the epistemic subject of empirical data already independently organized by the senses, right, by the external world, in which case it would not be synthetic a priori knowledge, and Kant therefore would be wrong? Or does the subject actively intervene in the knowing process and in the organization of the object? And you know the answer there. So, he thinks it's possible that studying the development of individuals in this epistemic kind of trajectory will be able to answer the question of what knowledge is, what the increase of knowledge is. And so he wants to say that all epistemology that's legitimate must become developmental. That's the major theme. Epistemology must take a developmental turn for him. This is true of the philosophy of science, which must become historical and has become historical, and it must be true of psychogenetic knowledge. It hasn't yet, but it needs to be. So both of these must become developmental in its methodology. Okay, so the question we began with was this: what is Piaget's concept of epistemology? And a fortiori, what is his concept of genetic epistemology? Does he see epistemology as philosophy of science or as general philosophy of knowledge? The short answer is that he uses the term epistemology to include both types of epistemology, what he calls historical critical philosophy of science, okay, and genetic psychology. But to complicate things, he also often argues that the psychogenetic epistemology that he studies, right, not only can add to the project of philosophy of science, historically conceived, but that the history of scientific knowledge is dependent on the psychogenetic construction of knowledge, so that psychogenesis can explain the development of knowledge in science, and therefore, in a sense, is going to be more basic than philosophy of science is. So in this sense, psychogenetic epistemology, the study of knowledge growth in the individual, is going to be more basic than understanding philosophy of science in a historical context. So that answer is not very satisfactory, but I think it's the one that he gives, at least in this account. So that's the little bit that I have to contribute to this question of what his epistemology was. It's a complex question, subtle, but I think this is what philosophers should be doing, should be investigating Piaget's notion of epistemology, genetic epistemology. My book does some of that, but much more needs to be done, and Les is working on the project. So I would like to see more of this kind of thing occur with respect to Piaget scholarship. So that's it, folks. Thanks. I realize this is really dense and hard to follow. The terminology, the switch, is a difficult kind of course to follow. But I think that has to be kind of what we do. Yes?
Just one more question.
Yeah.
You answered me science that's based in empirical observation in mathematics and logic. This is the answer of the logical empiricism. But we know that Piaget, with his work, has shown that the empiricism is an erroneous epistemology. So I wonder why you preach this erroneous epistemology as the science against the philosophy.
So Piaget wants to, every science must become experimental. And an experimental science is based upon empirical data. But that's not the case. The empirical data is to be interpreted according to the way empiricists interpret it. So the experimental data gets a different kind of interpretation, a more constructive, more cognitive interpretation. Now, he thinks the positivists didn't do that. He might be right. So he does have a lot of positivism in him with respect to thinking you've got to verify things if you know things. That doesn't mean you interpret it the way the positivists did, the way classical empiricists did, in terms of thinking incoming information and data consist of nothing but kind of brute sensations. That's true. Yeah.
I would like to add on this because information processing metaphor today is still in this epistemology of logical empiricism. And for me, I would like you to, it's not clear, I would like you to precise what is from you in these 6 epistemologies and what is from Piaget, because as I understood this book, is actually looking at the critique of logical empiricism. That's his starting point, and he ends up with a dialectical relation to epistemology. So what is your reading and what is in Piaget in those 6 standpoints?
So give me your question again.
What the part of what you presented us and Piaget's critique of logical empiricism, how do they relate together?
Well, so he gives several criticisms of it. One is the interpretation of incoming information. The second is he thinks that all positivism tried to put a limit on what science could do, and he thinks science has to be open to new methodologies, to new approaches, and so that was one of the faults of classical 19th century positivism, analogical positivism. They wanted to restrict kind of what science could do. So that's 2 criticisms he makes of it. So he has some features of positivism, no? I think he does. You have to verify things in science. Yeah? You have to have a check on things in science. That can be either experimental or it can be mathematical reasoning. But these 2 things are the hallmark of science, he thinks. Does that not seem reasonable?
Yes, it does. I just don't see the connection with the 6 points, like a refinement of what is the object of epistemology you propose to us, and his defense of a relational or dialectical epistemology in place of the logical.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's the way to go. He's a kind of, obviously he's an interactionist. He has a dialectical kind of component, strong component in him, however you interpret that kind of thing. That would be, to me, the kind of the way to understand him, yeah, that kind of way. And not the way the positivists understood things in terms of an atomistic way. Yeah, that conception is not one that he likes much. Yes?
Could you explain what you meant when you said that Piaget moved from empirical knowledge to knowing knowledge?
So the child begins, right, without any norms. Norms appear later. where do they come from? If you enter the world without normative judgments and beliefs, you have to acquire them, right? So norms emerge, standards emerge from earlier states that are not normative. How does that happen? Well, I mean, one way is society, right, advances certain norms that you accept. When you obey the laws out here, you accept that norm, and so you might not accept it. It's a norm in society that you might internalize and adopt, or you might construct a norm on your own. Come to recognize a norm, seeing it in your behavior, and so it winds up to be something you construct, something you adopt, whereas before you didn't have that. I mean, I know that's too simple, but I think something like that is probably what he has in mind, and Les knows a lot more about this than I do. So, but Les is not going to talk about that. So, I think that's enough of me, and I should turn it over to Les and let him talk about it.
The good news is I've got my sweets, so I expected one man or one woman and a dog, and so have a small number of handouts, and I got that wrong. I don't have a prior
I told you
knowledge.
more than six.
Could I request anyone who's got Wi-Fi access here and now in this room, could you please access my website, les-smith.net, and then go to recent papers, and you'll find 2 PDFs on there, les-smith.net, then recent papers. For those without, I have a small number of handouts. It's double-sided, and I think there's slightly more this side, so I'll start them here. And my apologies if you don't get one. Please grab from someone else or go and sit next to them and take it from there.
Actually, Wi-Fi is this has been approved.
Okay, I'll say something generally first, and that is that I take 2 key theses to which Piaget was almost always committed, certainly from 1924, and which are central to a priori knowledge. One is that realism is the metaphysical thesis that what there is a static set of objects which are unchanging. Piaget's version of realism is epistemic realism, according to which there ain't no such thing as reality in that sense of static, unchanging objects. Rather, he's committed to an epistemic realism, according to which what there is what is known there is. What is what is known there is. And if knowledge itself changes, and witness the history of science, it certainly does. Think of Newton's knowledge of space and Einstein's knowledge of space. If knowledge changes during its history, so be it. Under epistemic realism, that's a consequence. So that's one key thesis. You get it in his review of Brunschwig's books around about the turn of the 20th century, and certainly in Brunschwig's 1922 book, which Piaget put to really insightful review. The second key thesis to which Piaget was always committed is that reality, what is known there is, according to Piaget,